There are moments, rare and fleeting, when we catch a glimpse of what it feels like to be truly free. Free from the emotional burdens that we carry daily, free from the heavy expectations we impose on ourselves, and free from the fear of revealing who we really are beneath the surface. It might happen on a quiet evening when the world seems still and we're left alone with our thoughts, or perhaps during a deep, heartfelt conversation with a friend who genuinely understands us. In these brief moments, the weight we've been carrying for so long lifts, if only temporarily. We feel lighter, more open, and strangely vulnerable, yet it's not an unpleasant vulnerability. It's the kind of vulnerability that feels like liberation, as if, for just a moment, we've put down our emotional armor. This is the moment when we realize how much we've been protecting ourselves, and how much freer we might feel if we didn't always carry those defenses with us. However, reality inevitably sets back in, and we quickly remind ourselves that we can't always stay open like this. Life, we tell ourselves, is tough, and to survive, we need to be tougher. The vulnerability that felt liberating only moments ago now feels risky. We remind ourselves of the many reasons we built those walls in the first place. Perhaps we've been hurt too many times, perhaps we grew up in environments where showing vulnerability was met with harsh judgment, ridicule, or even indifference. We learned early on to protect our hearts, to keep our emotions hidden because vulnerability seemed too dangerous. The emotional armor we've carried into adulthood has served as a shield against pain, but it's also become a barrier that isolates us, keeping us from the deep connections we yearn for. We've become so accustomed to guarding ourselves that we've forgotten how to be vulnerable, not just with others but even with ourselves. We push down our feelings, convince ourselves that we don't need anyone, and live in constant fear that if we reveal our true selves, we'll be rejected or misunderstood. This protective stance has become second nature, and while it may have shielded us from hurt, it has also kept us from experiencing true intimacy and connection. But what if vulnerability wasn't something to fear but rather something to embrace? What if, instead of viewing it as a weakness, we began to see it as a source of strength? Vulnerability, after all, isn't just about exposing ourselves to potential hurt. It's also about opening ourselves up to deeper emotional healing and true freedom. It's about daring to be seen as we truly are, flaws and all, and trusting that we are still worthy of love, connection, and acceptance. Many of us learned in childhood that vulnerability was risky, that it made us weak or susceptible to harm. We were told to toughen up, to hide our emotions, and to be strong even when we were falling apart inside. In a world that often equates vulnerability with fragility, it's no surprise that many of us built walls around our hearts. But as we grow older, we begin to realize that the emotional armor we've carried for so long isn't just protecting us from pain, it's also preventing us from truly living. These walls may shield us from hurt, but they also isolate us, keeping us from forming meaningful relationships and experiencing the fullness of life. And yet, there is another side to vulnerability that is often overlooked. Vulnerability is not just about being open to pain, it's also about being open to connection, love, and the possibility of something greater. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we invite others to see us as we truly are, imperfect, yes, but also deeply human. We open the door to authentic relationships, where love and support are not conditional but freely given. Vulnerability requires immense courage. It is the courage to be seen, flaws and all, and to trust that we are still deserving of love and connection despite our imperfections. This is where the healing begins, when we start to believe that our vulnerability is not a liability but a powerful tool for forging deeper, more meaningful relationships with ourselves and others. When we stop seeing vulnerability as a weakness and instead embrace it as a doorway to greater connection, we allow ourselves to experience life more fully. So, how do we begin to embrace vulnerability in a world that often tells us to hide it? The first step is to challenge the way we think about ourselves. Many of us have internalized the belief that we need to be perfect to be loved, that we must always have everything together, and that showing emotion is a sign of failure or weakness. These beliefs are deeply ingrained in us, often stemming from our early experiences, but they are not truths. They are stories we've been told and repeated to ourselves for so long that they feel like facts. But they are not. Vulnerability is not a weakness, It is a strength. It is a fundamental part of being human. We need to challenge these stories and ask ourselves some important questions. What if I didn't have to be perfect to be worthy of love? What if my vulnerability is not something to be ashamed of but something to be embraced? What if, instead of hiding my imperfections, I allowed them to be seen, trusting that they are what make me human, what connect me to others in deeper and more meaningful ways? As we begin to challenge these beliefs, we also need to practice self-compassion. Too often, we are our own harshest critics. We judge ourselves for every mistake, for every emotion we think we shouldn't feel, and for every time we don't live up to the impossible standards we've set for ourselves. But self-compassion means treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a dear friend. Imagine if a friend came to you, struggling with the very things you often criticize yourself for. Would you be harsh with them? Would you tell them to toughen up, to stop being so sensitive? Or would you offer them compassion, patience, and understanding? Most of us would choose the latter. So why is it so difficult to offer ourselves that same kindness? Self-compassion is the foundation of emotional healing. When we stop judging ourselves so harshly, we create space for growth, for learning, and for change. We give ourselves permission to be imperfect, to feel deeply, and to take risks. We begin to see vulnerability not as a weakness but as a gateway to deeper connection, with ourselves and with others. As we practice self-compassion and allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we start to trust others more. We open up, little by little, and allow ourselves to be seen. And when we do, something magical happens. We realize that we are not alone in our struggles. We see that everyone in their own way is carrying burdens, fears, and doubts just like us. And in that realization, we find connection. We discover a sense of belonging that we didn't even know we were missing. This is the paradox of vulnerability. The very thing we fear most, being open, being seen, is what leads us to the deepest sense of connection and emotional freedom. When we embrace vulnerability, we allow ourselves to experience love, trust, and joy in ways we never thought possible. We no longer have to pretend or hide. We can show up as our authentic selves, knowing that we are worthy of love just as we are, imperfections and all. Of course, embracing vulnerability is not something we do overnight. It's a process, a journey that requires patience, courage, and self-compassion. But with each step we take toward openness, we begin to heal the old wounds that have kept us closed off for so long. We start to rewrite the stories we've been telling ourselves for years, and we realize that it's okay to be imperfect, to be human, to be vulnerable. The journey of healing is not about erasing the past or becoming someone new. It's about embracing who we are, fully, openly, and with love. And in doing so, we unlock the door to a life of deeper connection, greater joy, and true emotional freedom. What if, today, you chose to embrace vulnerability? What if, instead of hiding your true feelings, you allowed yourself to be seen? What if, instead of judging yourself for your emotions, you offered yourself compassion and understanding? By doing so, you begin the journey toward true emotional freedom and a life of authentic connection.